I'm Gordon Half. I'm a technology evangelist with Red Hat, and I'm joined here by Dylan Silva, who's with Ansible by Red Hat. Sorry if anybody was expecting Todd Barr. He had something come up and he could not make it to the summit, but I'm sure we will fill in admirably, hopefully. Anyway, what we're going to talk about today is really kind of give you a high-level view of how to get started with DevOps from both a sort of a dev-centric perspective and from an ops-centric perspective. So why don't you start us off?
Okay. So, yet again, somebody's talking about DevOps. I like to say this is probably the most beaten dead horse in the world to a pulp now, but we'll talk about it. We'll talk about what DevOps is, what it isn't, and how to get started with DevOps. I'll tell a little bit of my story being a DevOps practitioner. My prior role before Ansible, I was actually an architect that built a DevOps process in a very large APM-based SaaS platform. So I can talk to those stories and kind of tell you from my perspective what I feel about DevOps as a practice. So first, DevOps is definitely not a product. It is not a technology. It also isn't brain surgery. So, what is DevOps? It's a culture. It's a total mind shift and a practice change within an organization that emphasizes on collaboration between individuals within an organization, within teams, across teams, within an actual local team, between developers, sysadmins, QE engineers, even product managers, all the way up to the CEO. It is that much of a culture shift. It's enabling the automation of processes in between those teams, mostly around software delivery and infrastructure change as a result of that software delivery. So, to dive in more into the definition, it's just another overhyped IT trend. You know, I like the one in the middle. I've seen that one, and I lived that one plenty of times myself. It worked fine in dev, but it's not working in ops, so it's an ops problem. It's the proverbial throwing a ball over the wall. That's the kind of process that everybody is used to. That's the old way of doing things. The new way is enabling teams, mostly dev and ops teams, don't forget about the QE engineers either, to innovate faster, to release those products quicker, to get to a more streamlined process, to release those new features in a more timely manner, as opposed to the monolithic 3 to 6 month cycle of releasing software. And getting that code and those apps deployed in a much more meaningful manner, in a more repeatable manner, automation, and that we'll talk about more of. It's all two paths to a same singular place. Everybody in a company is working to the same types of goals, so why not take that goal and make a culture shift to help enable to get to that process? So, to kick it off, Gordon's going to talk about the dev side of the house, and then I'll take the ops side later.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I have somewhat of a developer background among lots of other random backgrounds. The other thing is that I was an industry analyst for about 10 years. So I really like to kind of think about how parts of IT map to other industries, other aspects of technology. And I actually have a complete presentation that kind of looks on lessons from manufacturing for DevOps, because I think if we look at the way the manufacturing, perhaps the auto industry in particular, has advanced over the last, 40 years or so, I think there's a lot of analogies and a lot of good lessons to be learned from what's happened in that industry to what we can do in software. And Dylan will go into more detail in the ops part of the talk about automation, but at risk of sounding like a broken record, a lot of people ask us, our consulting folks and myself, how do I get my arms around this big, perhaps overhyped trend, DevOps? And really the answer in a lot of cases, I'd say probably most cases, comes down to, pick some low-hanging fruit around automation and get started there. And the graph on the left-hand side here is sort of how productivity has improved in the auto industry and showing it being up about a factor of 2x over the period of about last 20 years or so. The thing is, I'd actually argue that graph sort of understates the effect of automation that we've had in the auto industry because, yeah, sure, productivity has improved, but if you look at the repeatability of things like kind of painting and machining and fit and finish type of things that have been heavily automated, there's just as big an effect on the quality that's being delivered. And when we talk about automation in DevOps, it takes a lot of different forms, but from a developer point of view, I think the most important thing is thinking in terms of the continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. So this was kind of traditionally a lot of manual steps here. So your developer wrote their code. They may or may not have pushed it up to a repo. They probably had some script somewhere that they'd probably written themselves and squirreled away to build that code. Then they had some test processes. And okay, again, maybe there were some scripts in there, but pre-manual. Then they set off an email and had a code review and all this kind of stuff, which might take a few weeks. And then only over time would you deliver and then deploy. Very manual process with lots of steps. And what we see in DevOps, and really what the core of a DevOps delivery pipeline is to automate a lot of this. Now, there may still be some manual code reviews, for example. This isn't something that's going to just come out of the sea and be totally realized on day one. But as companies sort of set up their DevOps systems, workflows, what they're going to do is they're going to start automating more and more of these. Now, you also notice that monitor and iterate box there. That's important too. How many of you are familiar with Deming? A few hands. So I don't have time in this presentation to go into a lot of detail, but read some of his stuff. It's pretty good. The short version is that after World War II, Deming sort of originated a lot of this idea of statistical quality control, things that became Six Sigma, this thing called a PCDA loop, a Schemming cycle or a Deming cycle, and this idea of measuring process, being very scientific, went to the American auto manufacturers. They're like, we know how to make cars. We're really good. So he went over to Japan, and this led to things like the Toyota production system, for example, which, of course, led to the American auto companies sort of figure out, well, they didn't really know how to build cars after all. And this kind of thing is very important in DevOps as well. I guess had a whole birds of a feather talking about measurement and metrics and so forth earlier, so I'm not going into it in a lot of detail here. But one framework I think is useful is think about metrics that are connected to your business outcomes. These aren't just things you do, but essentially behaviors, things that you're doing for the customer, things that connect to your revenue. So for example, may even be cultural. How happy are your developers? How happy are your ops people if they're not being paged as much on weekends? I'm sure that's never happened to you. Think about having alerts, but think about having alerts that are exciting. These are things that a red light goes on and you have to take action. These aren't things that are just sort of routine. And think about collecting lots of stuff to do trend analysis, maybe machine learning. You'll maybe kind of discover areas of your process, but don't confuse these things with each other. Another important lesson from the auto manufacturing industry is this idea of platform thinking. The fact that you have these modular parts and modular parts of designs that are shared among models, even brands within a given manufacturer. And basically today, we've moved to a point where about half of all cars made worldwide belong to, I think it's around 10 or so platforms. So this idea that you have certain common components and then you customize in various ways for a given model, for example. And the analog in DevOps is this idea of microservices, which some of you may have heard in the keynotes. And the idea here is that we're tending to move away from these big monolithic applications to smaller, more loosely connected services. And don't get too hung up on the purest microservices. You know, these must be 2 pizza teams. These must be very small. These must be only communicate with public APIs. But certainly the trend is towards these smaller, more loosely coupled services, which is in turn a good mix with DevOps, because you saw that pipeline earlier. And if you're using that pipeline to shove out small, loosely coupled services, that's going to work a lot better than if you're trying to shove out some big million-line monolithic hunk of code. And then finally, this idea that you do this DevOps on an optimized platform. If you think about DevOps as this sort of move from this craft work to this more industrialized set of processes, well, think about where that takes place. You sort of traditionally had this sort of craft work, workshop type of thing. And as you do this more industrialized process, you want essentially a factory that is optimized for that. And we did some survey work with IDC last year, and this was basically among DevOps early adopters. And one of the things they found was that almost everybody is saying, we are going to need new technology for this. Some of the things that you put in this factory, a lot of software-defined infrastructure, typically, so you're not having traditional things like disk arrays, automation I talked about, application lifecycle management, having sort of things for the developer experience, self-service is part of that, application services. So these are things like messaging, message buses, business rules, that kind of thing. Sort of the whole container ecosystem and the pieces in place to manage that container ecosystem. And one of the challenges with, that was a pretty long list, is how do you make that consumable for developers? Because, there's incredible innovation happening out there in this sort of whole container ecosystem, but it's a lot of work to pull that stuff together. And really what people are looking to do that is a platform as a service, or kind of moving away from that term, but certainly a container management platform. And Red Hat, really that's what we're doing with OpenShift. OpenShift brings together all these upstream projects, puts them all into the OpenShift origin, which is the upstream open source project, and then we deploy that in both the on-premise and the dedicated online service, and then the multi-tenant online service. And very briefly, there's a lot of talks at Summit if you all dive into this in more detail, and I'm certainly not going to do that right now. But basically, you have the sort of the container infrastructure. RHEL-based. What work we're doing with Atomic is in there. So this idea of immutable container infrastructure. You then have, and that's kind of like one system, and then you have the orchestration and resource management that sits on top of that. And there's a lot of other things too, like the registry for the containers. You have the container runtime. You have the Docker container format. And then you have more management policies, lifecycle automation, so things like cloud forms in conjunction with that. And then you have the XPaaS services that are sitting on top, in addition to a whole bunch of languages and frameworks and so forth. So you end up with having self-service with a bunch of different interaction models, the ways you can interact with it. There's CLIs, there's integration with Eclipse and so forth, lots of different languages, the container platform, and then automation with things like Jenkins to help you build out those delivery pipelines. And one thing that is a little unusual about OpenShift compared to some of the alternatives is there is a persistent storage option there, because a lot of these sort of newer type applications, they're often talked about as being stateless, but not all of them are. So with that, that's the very quick tour through the dev-centric part of things. So I'm going to turn back over to Dylan to talk about ops and to bring us home.
Let me grab that from you. All right. So let's look at some more fun slides. So we all hear about no ops, DevOps, why DevOps is a disaster now, why these culture shifts are things that can inhibit a company from producing quicker. Operations has always been felt to be a cost center, not a good thing to most organizations. No is always something that's associated with a sysadmin. So when a dev or a QE person comes to a sysadmin, they always feel like the sysadmin is ready to say, don't talk to me right now, do you have a ticket open, right? Most of that resounds with most of you, right? I know, because I did it myself. I'm guilty of it. So DevOps was the transition away from that. It's, that once again, a culture shift. And then you hear about no ops, where let's not have ops at all. Let's just all willy-nilly do something and get something deployed, and let's just keep iterating on that. It's all around iteration. So here's a great quote. The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. Mark Twain had this quote: when it comes to ops, it resounds with me personally, because operations will never die. There's always going to be some sort of operations. Whether or not that there's physically a sysadmin or an ops person or a site reliability engineer or a DevOps engineer, whatever you want to call them, there's always some sense of operations. You're going to be managing the service. Whether or not you're the developer managing the service, you're still doing ops. So you have to think about what processes do you have to take into place to help manage your application, operate your application. You don't have to physically be a sysadmin. So when it comes to the automation point of view, some things go hand in hand. The DevOps trend, at the same time that Ansible came out, I myself was, when I transitioned from my next previous job into my last job, I was looking for an automation tool. And around that same time, Ansible was incepted. It's the same time that this DevOps trend started to take off. And you can kind of see around that same time frame, this is 2013. Around 2012 is when this really started, that trend. You can see that's when Ansible started as well. You can see the uptick. And automation is one of those trends that continue. And Ansible, as an automation tool, has been the forerunner in driving a DevOps process. And I, for one, can definitely attest to that, because if it weren't for what I had with Ansible, I definitely wouldn't have made a DevOps practice within my last role. So, Ansible in itself, it is true IT automation. It is marketed a lot as a configuration management solution. I like to tick it as a full automation platform that allows you to deploy applications, manage your infrastructure, manage your environment as a whole. So it's not just the services that you're deploying internally, it's the services you might be dependent on as well. You can orchestrate and automate those as well. It is a simple, very, very simple, show of hands in the room of who uses Ansible today. Wonderful. How many of you that know what Ansible is, but you're interested in learning more about it? Awesome. All right. Well, definitely find me afterwards. I can tell more of my story for sure. I'm hanging out in the booths downstairs. We definitely can talk more, so do look for me. The simplicity of it is around the Ansible playbook. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. It is an agentless system. Technically not true. We utilize OpenSSH as our agent, more or less, or WinRM for the Windows systems, or basic API calls to network devices. For those of you that didn't know, we actually automate the build out of network devices as well. And then for any other services, it's mostly API-based as well. And it's powerful because of its not only config management, but it also does application delivery, multi-tier orchestration, and it also handles basic config management of your systems in tandem with your larger environment and provisioning cloud instances and doing some other really cool stuff. Ansible automates what you already do today as a practitioner of operations or in development. Your daily tasks that you pull up a document and you go through the process from top to bottom of what you're doing in your normal day-to-day job, you can write that into an Ansible playbook. It starts from the top, works its way down, and it will stop where any failure happens, and it will report back to you why that failure happened. And just to close it out once again, you can automate everything. It can be a Linux system, a Unix-based system, it can be a Windows system, network devices. We even do some cool stuff with containers I'll talk about in a little bit. And just a lot more. Anything that has a connection endpoint of some sort, you can automate with Ansible. So, automate to accelerate. Once you start automating, the acceleration that will happen into migrating into a DevOps type organization will just take off like a rocket ship. I definitely can say that will happen fairly quickly. So my story is, when I joined my last org, I was in a deployment nightmare of about an 8-hour process of deploying an application. I had to do 2 systems at one time. So 16 hours, right? One engineer. I was the only engineer. Not only did I have to deploy that, but I had to operate about 20 of them, 20 separate pairs. I was not happy with that. Once we got with Ansible into our environment, and granted, this was when Ansible was first incepted. It was about 0.9, if I remember the version correctly, only a few modules. I got it down to a 5-minute deployment time. So me as an ops engineer, I was more focused on application performance, obviously working for an APM group, right? But I was able to focus my time on innovating the application rather having to babysit and deploy that application. So right away, we became more DevOps centric because my innovation was focused on something else. It was a more positive return on investment effectively. Once the slide switches, there we go. Who here got to see the J.Crew talk earlier this morning? So J.Crew's story is very similar to a lot of the stories that we have for all of our customers. J.Crew tells a story about deploying their application. Similar to mine, it took them 5 hours with multiple engineers in a single room. Deploying those Java applications, we all know that's a pain in the butt. They dropped it down to a single engineer at random, could be any person, clicking a button. They even joke about walking away and going to have coffee and coming back. And Ansible Tower shows them that it's completed. Another customer of ours, NEC, they use Ansible Tower and Ansible Core as the back end of Tower to provide a self-service platform internally to their customers. We have a process built into Ansible Tower called a survey, So what a survey does is as an Ansible playbook writer imports their playbook into Tower, and when a job is kicked off for that playbook, a window pops up asking some basic questions about that job. Those are tied directly to variables within the playbook. And that's what enables that self-service model internally to systems. And NEC leveraged that to provision new VMs in their internal cloud. This specific use case is a very common use case for when it comes to self-service, just an enablement to speed up that process, because we all know this is one of the largest cost centers when it comes to IT administration today. And then finally, this is one of the coolest ones. Who here knows what Riot Games builds? Who here has heard of League of Legends? Very large game. Every single data center that is opened up as that game continues to grow, it's a very large multi-million-dollar game, is built with Ansible Tower. All of their network devices are provisioned from bare metal to a brand new, fresh spanking new network device to start continuing on their deployment process of the game. Which was just a true testament to what Ansible could do. Cool thing about this story, this was before we even launched our configuration management around network devices. They did it all on their own. They built it themselves. That's how easy it is to manage Ansible. For things that we don't even provide as a community, they were able to do internally themselves. And now that we provided them true support within network devices, it just took them to the next level as well. And then Juniper Networks. They're a customer of ours. They're a huge proponent. They're kind of the same self-service model internally. The only difference with theirs is they're a true hybrid model where they have a private cloud internally that they manage. They build that private cloud out with Ansible Tower, and they also manage the instances that are provisioned within that cloud with Ansible Tower. And then in the public cloud, they take those same playbooks and provision the same type of instances in the public cloud. So they have one thing they have to manage. It innovates a lot quicker for them. So, that all being said, we like to say that Ansible is the language of DevOps. From your dev and test engineers through QE all the way to the system integrators external to an organization, all can leverage the playbook as the conduit to communicate between teams, to enable that communication and enable themselves to innovate at a quicker pace. And Ansible is the only automation engine that can automate an entire application lifecycle. So, old ops versus new ops. The old way is centered around systems, platforms, agents. Everything's very siloed. There's a lot of control. Nobody has access to systems. Nobody can even touch a log on a system. There's a golden image that gets deployed. A lot of heroics because this one person found that one line of a log file that said, oh, this service wasn't started. You know, everything is continued to be locked down. Everything's monolithic, and it's a function and limit of change. More deployments over less time. To the new way, everything is service-oriented. Everything are micro apps that are being deployed across multiple systems. Hybrid approach. We aren't caring about, oh, now I have to build a system again in my data center, and now I have to worry about this cloud thing. I have a public cloud that I have to worry about as well. How do I make sure that my image is the same? No more. You don't have to worry about that in the new ops ways. Everything's API driven. A lot of sysadmins are understanding APIs now. They aren't afraid to code anymore. So it's more away from traditional system administration, more to DevOps. So that's why you hear people say that DevOps is or is not a title. Talk to me later if you want to know my view. It's all about enablement, enabling a team at large as opposed to going back to those heroics, right? making yourself, your job, disposable. It's a scary thing, but making yourself disposable doesn't necessarily have to mean get yourself out of a job. It's making yourself more available to do more to help enable the organization to move quicker. All about automation. Can't stress that one enough. Trust but verify. I can't say that enough. It doesn't hurt to verify what you are doing in your automation, in your processes. It's trusting that everything that you've written is working, but you definitely verify that everything is going to work the way that you expect it to. And the beauty with Tower is it allows that verification to come to the forefront as opposed to playing a guessing game. Everything's modular. I'm a huge fan of modular approach. Processes and practices, this is the key here. If you don't change processes, if you don't change practices internally, DevOps is just not going to work. You're going to be beating that dead horse even harder. So, how do I decide that it's time to move out of old ops into new ops and start this DevOps trend? First, identify what problem you're trying to solve for. You can't just say, oh, I'm DevOps now. It doesn't work like that. What is the state of your organization? Are they ready for this change? If they're not ready for this change, it's going to turn into a political battle. You don't want to go down that path. I'm sure you all don't want to deal with more politics that there already exist. And then, is this going to be in the existing infrastructure? If that is the case, you definitely have a lot more to think about. It doesn't mean you can't do it. Ansible definitely can help with that for sure. But if it's a net new environment, of course that's going to be a lot easier because that's just the way it goes. You can start with new processes and kind of go along with there. So looking at this diagram, when you decide what the state of your culture is and where you're looking to get benefit out of a DevOps practice, kind of pick where you want to go with what approach you want to take. I started with automation. I literally did leverage Ansible as the language to discuss between my teams because we did have issues in communicating because we were literally siloed teams. But eventually we got to a point where our playbooks became that conduit for us to say, this is how the application is being deployed. And as a result of that, this is how we managed this system, how we monitored it, how we operated it day to day. Because the devs then understood this is how it was being deployed to our systems. So when they started developing new code for the systems, they knew what our processes were. But there's other ways you can take that. When it comes to the new stuff, there's containers. You've got hybrid clouds. A lot of new tools out there. Everybody knows Docker. OpenShift, I'm a huge fan of. I've always been a Kubernetes fan myself. Ansible ourselves, we built a cool tool called Ansible Container. Who here has heard of Ansible Container? It's fairly new, so I'm not surprised if anybody hasn't. Ansible Container is take that playbook. We will automatically build from that playbook a Docker image that you can then use to deploy into OpenShift or Kubernetes or any other container-based platform that you want to deploy into. Once again, enabling multi-environment support. Another approach is taking a team and building a showcase app, basically doing Scrum days and doing demos continuously amongst teams, fostering more communication. Or if you're net new, or if you're already a siloed thing, approach it from a culture standpoint and just start communicating between each other. I can't stress enough that it's all about communication, because if you don't communicate, it's just not going to work. There are going to be heads butting at times, but overlook those and just march forward and just be friendly, hug it out.